How many of you are new? Well, we're going to roll on. Continuation. Okay, good. As I said, we're going to have about an hour, and then I apologize. I'm going to leave a little earlier than this was scheduled because I have a flight to catch back home. And when I joked earlier that I give good advice on balancing personal and professional lives, I vowed that I'm going to try to spend more time at home with my family. And I want to get home tonight. All right? And I don't do a good job of that. You had a question that I think is germane.
Yes, you mentioned that you do cultural assessments in your organization. How do those compare to maybe what we might consider a general employee opinion survey or employee satisfaction measurement? Are they one and the same, different?
They can be related, but they're different in this context. We, like many companies, do periodic surveys of our employee population. And as part of that survey, we ask a lot of different things, clearly, but we also ask diversity, a subset of diversity-related questions. And in the U.S. only, we ask for race, ethnicity, and gender. We don't do that outside the U.S. because remember what I said, that race is very differently defined, and we're dealing with a different American historical experience. We do 100% sample of all of our employees every 18 months. Very expensive, by the way. And we use an outside consultant firm to do that. We do pulse surveys every 6 months with 25% of the sample. We have a return rate so far, it's only been done twice, of 78%, which if you've done any kind of surveying, you know is extremely high, extremely high. That's different. When I said a cultural, she asked me about the cultural assessment. Let me give you an example. Clearly, what I think one of our most diverse environments at Apple is our manufacturing site in Fremont, California, which is in the East Bay of San Francisco. Fremont is about 60% of color and about a third immigrant. There, the management team asked my office to come in and do an assessment. And we can also volunteer with divisions, and often they take our advice. What the management team in Fremont wanted to know is, can we get a handle on what people feel about the diversity on that site from the perspective of quality of life for everyone? From the perspective of does diversity hinder or help quality of production, productivity, teamwork, all of those things that are very important for us in corporate or any other settings, all right? We develop structured questionnaires and interviewing approaches, and we look at a cohort of subsamples within that plant. So we looked at people in terms of occupation as one of the cuts, departments, where they were located, distribution within the plant from highest to lowest or lowest to highest. We also looked at people in terms of race, of course, gender, age cohorts, because Apple tends to be a very young environment. Our median age is probably about 29, which is quite young, by the way. I'm an old man there, and I'm not being self-serving. And we have a lot of problems sometimes with a white man coming to me who was 45 years old and saying, Santiago, these young people drive me crazy. It has nothing to do with race, obviously, or gender. We also looked at national origins. We have, God knows, I don't know how many origins at Fremont, and we couldn't get every subsample that's statistically accurate. But for example, we have Latinos of different backgrounds, Mexican American or Mexican immigrants, Salvadorians a lot, Guatemalans, Nicaraguans, so we look at subsamples there, and then pulled in also overall Latino. There were no different patterns there, by the way. We looked at Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, Chinese, very few Japanese Americans, Filipino, quite a lot. So that was a subsample. We also looked at sexual orientation, by the way. We don't keep data on people's sexual orientation because we think that's private. But in many instances, people are willing to volunteer that information. And we have a very active gay and lesbian organization that helped us do it in identifying people. And because many people, for a variety of reasons, didn't want to be interviewed as a gay person, we gave people the option of being interviewed off-site if they wanted to be that, so that there was privacy there. But we got a lot of cooperation. And all of the, and I'll talk a little later, all of the employee organizations were extremely helpful. We have a very active Black organization, Hispanic organization, Asian organization, Apple Professional Women's Organization, Apple Senior Women's Organization, Male Support Staff Organization, Jewish Cultural Group, etc., etc. And all of those groups are enlisted to help us out, getting the message across why we're doing it. And very importantly, in any survey or assessment, people get cynical if you do an assessment and then you don't come back and tell them what you've learned and what you're going to do. And not just what you're going to do, what you actually do. Because that breeds more cynicism and probably negative approaches than not doing anything at all. So anytime you do a survey, as you know, of any kind of assessment, make sure that when people know you're doing it, why you're doing it, what you plan to do with it, and follow through on it. And on ours, we've done a lot of follow through. Does that help?
It does. You look also at things like age and marital status,
Mm-hmm.
and also education. We found in a recent survey, for example, when we looked at education, that the more highly educated female that was not a person of color had clearly different opinions than those.
One of the stereotypes that we dispel within Apple is that the only way you get a job, a good job in quotes at Apple, is if you went to MIT, to Stanford, Caltech, etc. We dispelled that myth when we did a survey, which was, the survey, we got the data, we just ran it through the computer, that the largest number of degree recipients went to San Jose State University, which in the hierarchy of things by some people isn't considered, quote, as good as other schools. But since we hire only stellar talent, obviously we must have found stellar talent at San Jose State, right? So you're dealing with myths of a different kind. We spend a lot of time independent of my program, but often related to it, on work-family issues. Because we have a whole task force and program on that. And work-family issues, almost 40% of the women working at Apple are single parents. A very high percentage. So that's a real issue for a whole variety of job-related reasons. And we try to be helpful. We also have a system, and this is what I was going to talk about, but we have a fairly extensive child care system, including one what we call a campus. We have major programs through our fitness center, because we have gyms, like private gyms have, and a lot of health and service programs that come through that. One of the reasons I went to Apple, I was really impressed with the human resource program. It's better done than most places. Some things we don't do well. And by the way, when I talk about Apple, please understand it sounds self-serving. I'm here to give you examples, and it sounds great. It is not nirvana. I characterize it as a struggle, as an evolution. We have a long way to go. If we had all the answers, we could be packaging and marketing this all over the place. And that's not what we're doing, all right? Nor do I think it should be. Understand our philosophy as a company, too. During the last presidential campaign, Mr. Bush wanted to be photographed at our child care center when he was coming through California, and we told him no. Not because we don't like Republicans or Democrats or vice versa, but because we don't think our children are a child care center to be used politically by anyone. More recently, we had ABC News, the national news, Peter Jennings, whom I think is the best of the three, it's my opinion. You don't have to share that. But at any rate, they wanted to do, during this whole layoff, horrendous things that have been happening in the industry, because layoffs have been all over the place. And by the way, things are not getting better, all right? Not getting better. We have a vested interest in things getting better, because it's important for our business, but we don't see it. And I think that's true for the industry overall, and other industries too. But at any rate, Channel 7, you wouldn't know that. ABC News wanted to do a story on a company that did layoffs right, if there's such a thing. It's one of the most painful processes I have ever experienced. I had never in my life had to lay off someone personally, and I did. And I couldn't sleep for days. And that's just to understand my personality. Because you can only factor job-related considerations when you're ranking people in terms of business needs. But you know people who work for you personally. And when I had to lay off a woman who happened to be a friend and a single parent with 2 kids, I worried about what happens to her, even though I'm not supposed to think about those things. Because in a ranking where we're challenged legally, we have to depend on purely abstract, numerical grounds. At any rate, we denied Channel 7, or in this case ABC News, the opportunity to interview at our what we call Transitional Resource Center. Because we put together a huge center for people we laid off, for individualized counseling. Everybody got 10 hours of personal counseling by outside consultants. We did group counseling. We did, of course, how to do your resume, job postings, all of that kind of stuff, which many companies do. But I think we did it relatively well. And they wanted to do a story to give us credit, good public relations. We again said no. With all this pain and suffering, the last thing our employees or ex-employees want to deal with is your national news coming in saying, look how great this company is doing it, because the employees using it aren't feeling great. And we weren't feeling great about the process either. That gives you perspective also in terms of value. Every company has its own set of ethics, and hopefully most of our ethics are in sync. But as I said, we are a very publicly value-driven company, and we make that clear to employees from the beginning. One of the reasons I think we've had relative success in getting into the diversity argument is also why I took the job is that human resources, as I told the CEOs this morning, at Apple, more so than not, by far, is a business partner. I can't imagine any management meeting taking place at Apple on any issue in which human resources isn't there from the beginning as an active partner. Because if you're serious about human resources being your greatest asset, because we all say that, then how can you do any kind of business planning without thinking about that factor from the beginning? And our senior HR people are all called officially business partners. They're organizational integrationists, because there's a lot of conflict across organizations, as you know, in any corporation. And that's where we spend a lot of time and effort. Any other questions? And then we'll go into the rest of the stuff that I want to share with you today. Don't be shy. I know this is not the greatest setting. By the way, there's some seats up front for those, unless you love standing up. I want to give everybody their personal choice. Just don't sit on the tape recorder. Let's see, we finished off on types of culture. Let me suggest what I would think would be a logical question after you've heard all of that. You could say, my God, Santiago, even if you only focus on national cultures, there are so many in the world. How in the world did you get your arms around that? Remember, the focus of diversity programs is on yourself. There is no way you can know about even the national cultures of the world, much less gender cultures, age cultures, occupational cultures, all of those things that make human beings into value units, if you wish, because that's what makes one person a composite of all of those things, but you can't know about your values. What I suggest is the following, and as I said, we spend a lot of time on this in my company, and certainly within our profession, on how we factor out in terms of ourselves and how we work with people. What I suggest to people is, if you think of cultures as all having the same needs, because cultures do. Cultures are made up of human beings, and human beings all have the same needs. That's what makes us a common humanity, all right? Where we get in trouble with one another, or we have management problems, it's not that we have the same needs, because if we all had the same way of doing it, there wouldn't be a reason for this conversation at all. The problem is not that the needs are different, it's that we express the very same needs differently. Let me give you examples. In needs, for example, I don't know of a single culture that doesn't define or require respect. Now that's a very vague term, but every one of you have your own judgments of respect. And you know when someone is being disrespectful. See what I meant to talk to you personally earlier? Focusing on yourself. See, why is this person doing that? In Spanish we say que me falta el respeto. When we say that in Spanish, if somebody isn't giving me respect, we write you off. Okay? That's a broad generic statement. I don't deal with people who don't show me respect, because it means that they're people without ethics. And every culture defines that differently. By the way, what I did is a very cultural gesture. How many of you have used it? In Spanish-speaking culture, it's very common. It's an ancient one. Where does it come from? Pontius Pilate, right? Washed his hands of the whole thing. And in Mediterranean culture, it's a very common way of saying, I don't want to deal with that. Okay? Different cultures use body language, as you know, in very different ways. Okay. All cultures define time. All cultures define space. And by the way, respect overshadows all of these. Space, by that I mean not outer space. Space between people or among people, all right? All cultures communicate. Direct, indirect, verbal, non-verbal. All cultures define relationships. Friends, strangers, family, those are all relationships. And they all have impact, as you sort of implied with your question about education, on benefit structures. What do you do as an aside, but related to this, in a situation where you have significant others in non-legal married relationships? Remember, the essence of human resources is to have productive employees, not to be nice. It's important to be nice, but it's number one is to be productive. The essence of human resource strategy then is to attract the best talent and to keep it. And that's where we have a common benefit system. And in competing with other companies for the same talent, all right? And if you have so-called, term I don't like, non-traditional relationships, non-traditional generally means it's things you never thought of before or make you uncomfortable, all right? But they've generally been around for a long time. Non-traditional people, I mean, what people is non-traditional have been around in the space of this earth forever, all right? But anyway, let's say if you have, we are all governed by external environments. So, for example, in benefits, we often are governed by ERISA, Department of Labor, and by IRS definitions of relationships. Now, let's say on a fluffier side, you have a bereavement policy. And let's say, whatever, you can take up to 5 days for an immediate relative to go to a funeral or to take care of issues that arose. I mean, that's fairly common in American practice today. It says immediate family. Well, what we've been starting with is how you define family. But we can find, and this is not to knock traditional families, but most of our families are no longer, quote, traditional. Donna Reed is not alive and well in Santa Clara Valley. I'm being facetious, all right? It isn't. I mean, a family with a husband and wife and 2 kids and a dog is rare. Most of our families are very different, and you may find that good or bad. I'm showing you this as a reality. And the point is we want to make sure that people are effective. Remember I said almost 40% of our women are single parents. Very different needs culturally than so-called complete family, all right? But let's say you have someone, as we've had horrendous experiences, somebody on your staff says that his partner died of AIDS. Now, we can legally say, no, you're not a family. What we tell our people is we're governed by external environments, yes, but we always tell our people use the high road. Managerial supervision. They can come to us if their manager doesn't. Because if you know that that's an established relationship, it is human, first of all, humane to give somebody the time off. And by the way, it's never been an issue within the company anyway, that kind of thing. But you have to be sensitive to that kind of issue. What do you do on the other hand if I get a man electronically send me a note saying, that our AIDS education program is sexual harassment? It kind of freaked me out, by the way. I said, can you be more precise? We believe that AIDS education is dramatically important in our area because it's something we live with all around us. But beyond that, why is sexual harassment? Because we're talking about gay issues. But AIDS is not only a gay issue, even though it's predominant in that community. And we have a right and must educate our employees about that. He was using sexual harassment and a definition so broad that I don't think it was applicable. And he wanted us to quote policies, because some people relate to policies. So we quoted policies. We said, we believe in educating employees. We believe in health and fitness for our employees. We have a non-discrimination policy on sexual orientation, if that's of interest to you, blah, blah, blah. So we can show you the policies, but we try not to react to people in a policy-driven way. Because people can either look at a policy, ignore it, or deal with it, one way or the other. Continue. All cultures have systems of recognition or reward. Now, let me go into subcategories, and remember the focus is on yourself, because that's the only handle you can have in this life. Maybe if you have a spouse or a significant other or children, you can get a handle on them that you don't have even there, you're never quite sure, right? Am I right? Okay? And that's part of the fun of being human, by the way, that we're all terribly predictable at probably be dreadfully dull, too. Let me start with respect. Think of subcategories of your own that you might want to explore on your own, but you don't need me for this. One sign of respect in North America, in English-speaking North America, is that you look people in the eyes when you talk to them. Most of you were raised with that notion that when you're talking to someone, please look them in the eyes. It's seen as a sign of steadfastness, of honesty, sincerity, all of those types of things, right? If you're interviewing someone who doesn't look you in the eyes, no matter how qualified, is that good or bad? Very bad. Gee, resume is great, resume is fantastic. That couldn't look me in the eyes. Something about it makes me uncomfortable. Remember to focus on yourself. When you having somebody behave in front of you or with you that strikes you as different or strange or negative, focus in with, is it because you're evaluating him or her in terms of your own criteria? And by the way, you may be right in terms of your final judgment for other reasons, but make sure that it isn't your cultural filter that's interfering with how you're rating an individual that you need to hire or promote or do anything of that sort. Because then, by definition, you eliminate the first-generation notion of having standards that measure what we say they measure, rather than our own filters, all right? Now, a group of social scientists did a study on eye contact in English-speaking North America. Most English-speaking people in North America, in a private conversation, keep a glance for about 17 seconds, roughly. People vary, but generally the average is 17 seconds. Beyond 17 seconds, it's invasive. It's a stare. We've all sat with people or talked with people who wouldn't let go, right? I don't know about women, but I know with men it becomes a real male dynamic too. Because I know with men, myself included, I start thinking, I'm not going to be the first to let go. Right? And that is a notion, but we know when it gets too long, and we're not sitting there timing. You spend 17 seconds, time to turn. Remember, culture is mostly unconscious. It's a culture rhythm, and you learn it, but you're not aware of it, all right? Now, Hispanics, for example, believe in eye contact also. Before I rip this out. But generally, Hispanics hold eye contact in a personal conversation for no more than 5 seconds. So if you're applying this unknown 17-second standard to Hispanics, you might think that a Hispanic talking to you is furtive. He or she keeps looking right, but if you move to the side, if you're looking down. Because it's disrespectful to hold a glance too long. East Asians and Southeast Asians, on average, depending on level of acculturation, but in the traditional cultures, often consider eye contact disrespectful. So to use a practical example, you have a first-generation immigrant, Chinese R&D engineer, looks on paper and references like he walks on water. But the only thing was he couldn't look you in the eyes, made you uncomfortable. If you use the wrong filter, you may not be hiring the R&D engineer you need because you applied the erroneous filter and defined respect in a way that didn't apply to him or vice versa. And by the way, as an aside, one rule that all companies or organizations have, an obligation that they have, is to interpret what works to new groups of people. That's one set of programs you can develop. So let people know, coaching and mentoring programs are some of the most popular in that way, but there's other ways you can do that. Secondly, much harder to do is, what do you take from cultures that haven't been there before and make it part of your present culture? And as you know, cultural change by definition is very slow, evolutionary, it takes time. But we also can't go on the assumption that what we've done all along is the best thing to do, because it isn't necessarily. That again speaks to diversity as a strength. Gender dynamic in terms of eye contact. I would suggest to you that in almost every culture in the world, women have been socialized not to look men as directly in the eyes as they do each other when men do one another. So that if eye contact is a filter you're looking for in terms of respect, you may be judging women erroneously for that reason if a woman holds a glance as a man does. In Latino culture, in fact, the argument can be made that if a woman maintains the glance of a man, she runs a sexual risk. It's really dangerous. Unless that's what you're after. So you get that complication. Okay? Another part of respect, and you can think of a lot, and if you think about it a little, think of what you think is respect. A lot of cultures have a hard time saying no. A lot of people have a hard time saying no. I joked earlier, the reason I'm here is because I have a hard time saying no. I'm not joking, by the way. If you ever get through my screening of my associate, to me, I have a hard time saying no. So lesson number 1, all right? And that's a personal failing professionally, because there's so much to do. Part of it's driven by guilt. It really is. I think it's true in many of our civil rights communities. We know there's so much to do, and we feel bad in saying no. But it's also looks bad we say in Spanish, all right? Arrogant, because it presumes that we're the only ones who can do it, and that's nonsense. And that creates what I call in Spanish a caudillo complex, or patron. You're the only one that's got all the answers. One reason I left D.C., by the way, several reasons, but one reason I left D.C. to move to the West Coast was because in the Latino community in D.C., I was becoming a patron. And people, as an incredible compliment and sign of respect, people would ask me to help them on virtually everything. I got called at 2 in the morning. Woman saying her husband's beating her, help me. You know, it's a dreadful thing to get at 2 in the morning. Those of you working at arena know that. Or at 3, my son's been caught by immigration. Can you help me? But as long as you have a patron syndrome, you don't help yourself. Because what happens when patrons are gone, or there's only 2 or 3 to go around, or 4 or 5, or whatever the number it is. And I'm not saying that arrogance, please understand, but there are elements in cultures that are very different about it, and we need to teach people how to do it themselves more. Not saying we can't relate and deal with other people and other resources, but people have more control of their lives and can do that. And again, it depends on the culture. Saying no. Americans, on average, to give you a point, average, a lot of exceptions, are generally more vocal about expressing disapproval, no, in many cultures. We're thought of as more direct. The British think of us as brash. I'm not saying they're right, but the British generally use what they call understatement. When I was reading admissions folders at Stanford, I remember if I got something from a British headmaster, it was frightening to read the stuff because you really have to think cultural translation. If they introduced a young man as a frightfully thoughtful young fellow, the guy walked on water. American person, Jenny, on average, would say, take this person, best thing that ever hit Boise, Idaho, this guy's going to be governor of Idaho someday, blah, 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 blah. Very different approach in terms of endorsements, all right? But in terms of saying no, when we did our assessment in Fremont that you asked about, Pretty much a large Vietnamese population. And I remember one item that came in this context to me. Black, white, and Hispanic supervisors uniformly in the survey said that their Vietnamese employees were good people. Good from the perspective of very quality-oriented, productivity-oriented, team-oriented, all the stereotypes about certain Asian groups, but correct in this sense. I mean, we could show that numerically. But every time they told me this, and I don't care whether it was a black, white, or Hispanic person, they would look at me and say, but you know, Santiago, these people drive me crazy. Which obviously gave you a hint that there was something else playing. And I said, tell me more. Because, well, you know, Santiago, every time we agree on something, I with my employees who are Vietnamese, or after we negotiate something, they go out and do exactly the opposite. In fact, some said, oh, right, these people lie. They agree with you, and then they do something different. What they didn't understand was playing is that Vietnamese culture has a very difficult time saying no, particularly to a superior. And in this case, even when you know that your supervisor is a fool, you don't contradict him or her. You agree. So when the Vietnamese say yes, they don't mean yes. If you look at aspects of African American English, and that's probably one of the richest sources of American English in terms of what shaped our experience, and I just cut this off. God, this looks like an intravenous device. But anyway, I remember my old neighborhoods in D.C. watching people, because I like to watch people a lot, and you see an animated conversation, let's say two black men, and one guy would, face sort of contorted, look back and say, I hear you. I hear you didn't mean I agree. I hear you doesn't mean you're saying the right thing. I hear you meant I heard you. And one of two things. Either I don't want to talk about that right now, or I don't want to deal with it right now. See what I'm saying? We presume sometimes that there are people who readily say no. Vietnamese people don't. By the way, most supervisors are not interested in intellectual abstraction, maybe on their own time, but not at work. So what they want to know is a good question. How do I fix this? That one is simple. Don't ask yes and no questions. Yes and no questions will always get you yes. As you know, there are other ways you can collect data, the information you want, and it doesn't have to be in a yes and no mode. And that's what I would recommend when you ever have that concern. You also have to be careful in terms of authority and respect, in terms of yes and no in certain cultures, a whole variety of cultures. I've done some work with healthcare organizations in California that are heavily Latino, and I found that not unusual in medical practice, a doctor or a specialist, sometimes a nurse, will go to a patient that's come in and say, before that person hasn't had a chance to talk, and says, does it hurt here? And even when it hurts here, I touch the shoulder. Even when it hurts here, I know in many aspects of Latino culture, say, well, he's the doctor. He must know where I hurt. Nothing funny. Creates real problems with misdiagnosis. Don't do leading questions, because culturally those are leading questions. It's presumed that a person in authority and with training knows what they're talking about. So don't even suggest the answer. It's a real problem in a variety of cultures. Again, remember, the only way you know about it is turn it inward on yourself. You consider it normal, I think, most of you, but if a doctor says, does it hurt here, and it hurts here, he says, no, it hurts here, that's why I'm here, not there, unless you know something I don't, that kind of stuff. When we negotiate with Japanese business people, which we do a lot, because we have a major breakout strategy in Japan, we found, not unusually so, that in Japanese culture, when people don't want to deal, on average, with a subject, they simply don't respond. They say nothing. Yet in much of Western culture, when I'm saying something to you, and you don't contradict me, I assume implicit agreement. Because if it was something near and dear to you, you would say, hey, wait a second, Santiago. No, right? Japanese folks and many other cultures often simply don't say anything. And we've made major mistakes by assuming they agreed with us. When all they were saying is, someone's like, I hear you, I don't want to talk about it. Not now, maybe later. Or you're making me uncomfortable, because that could be the other signal. You have to be really careful about those kinds of things. Think of other items in respect in your minds, and you might be able to come up other arenas in terms of your own value systems. Time. Every culture defines time. I'm just going to give you a couple of nuggets here and there. If a group of people is always late, are they truly always late? They're quite predictable, I think. When I moved to California, my first bombastic statement was that Californians are always late. I used to go to 10 o'clock meetings at 10 o'clock when I was the only one there. Everybody else was up at 10:20. After a while, you learn that meetings at Stanford University, where I was before, at Apple, start at 10:20 when they mean 10. Now, if you want to show up at 10, that's fine, but nobody else is going to be there. I'm exaggerating, but not by much, by the way. If you do that in New York City on average, and they say 10 o'clock, they mean 10 o'clock. They do. I lived in Germany, in Berlin, as I told you earlier, for 5 years. And Germans expect you to be there on the dot, especially for a professional appointment. But what Germans often do to make sure they're there on the dot is to come early. Yet it's rude in that culture, disrespectful, in the context of time, to knock on the door before the time has struck. So Germans often show up 5 or 10 minutes early, wait till 10 o'clock if that's the appointment, and then knock on your door. Socially, I had that happen at my house once. I live on a hill in San Francisco, so I can look down on the street. And a German couple was coming to visit us, and I saw that it came early. And it just happened that I was ready anyway. So I made a major mistake. I walked down and said, listen, you don't have to sit in your car. Come on out. Well, they were mortified. So I told them nicely, as we got to talk about it and joked about it later, I said, next time park 6 blocks away and I won't be able to see you. Because I'll feel compelled in terms of my definition of being a host to come and get you. All right? Because that's another one. All right? In Holland, by the way, it's standard practice often to come 5 minutes early to a meeting. Dutch are even more time compulsive, if you want to use that term, than Germans or other people. By the way, business rules are often very different from personal rules, social ones obviously. We all adjust to business rules in a different way than we do in our personal lives. If you were to be invited to my house for dinner on a Saturday night, which is unlikely because I don't invite strangers to my house, cultural notion. One way Americans often show friendliness is to invite people, fairly strange people, wrong, people who are strangers or really not friends to their house for dinner. That's the way we as the people often show friendliness. Not everybody, but in the culture it's not uncommon. I noticed that when I dealt with English-speaking people a lot, that people were very free about inviting you to their house. Now, we have a big office, European headquarters in Paris, and we did in the cultural assessment there. And we have a few American expats, expatriates living there, and they uniformly say, the French are rude, arrogant, all that horrible things. I love Paris, by the way. I could live in Paris, so my bias is there. But anyway, I said, why do you think the French are unfriendly? I've lived here for 3 years in Santiago, and none of these French people have ever invited me to their house. French don't, they never will. French people, on average, don't believe that you invite people to your house who are not family. They won't invite you to dinner at a restaurant, or a cafe, or a bistro. Because in their culture, that's where you do that sort of interaction with friends. Home is family, and no one else. So you have to be careful. In the social arrangement, when I said invite you to my house on a Saturday, I would tell you dinner at 9, as a Puerto Rican. 9 is even late for many people on a Saturday. But you know what I really mean? And I'm not kidding. A social invitation for dinner at my house in Puerto Rican context is 11 o'clock. It's 2 hours later. 2 hours later. And by the way, we don't serve you dinner until 2 or 3 in the morning. Just before you go home, you visit with people. That's the purpose of being there. Eating is the last act before you leave. In other words, in my culture, it's all right to eat and run. Because you've been there for hours, all right? We also rationalize it by saying that everybody's been drinking for 3-4 hours, so theoretically the food should sober up. There's no medical evidence to show that it does that, by the way, but at least people like to think they do, all right? Does that make sense, what I'm talking about? Think about you can easily get a handle on how you value time, whether you're punctual, whatever that means or not, where you're flexible and where you're not. That would give you a lot of hint about yourself and also about dealing with other people. Space. Aren't Latinos touchy-feely? Yes and no. Probably true answer for everybody, by the way, the points you make. On average, I would say yes. In the same sex, no cross-sexually. I would never touch a Latina whom I'm not related to or not a close friend of. If I did, her family or boyfriend would kill me. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. I've been, as a young man, in many a fight, and I don't like fights. I don't go out of my way to get into fights, because somebody told me that I looked at his visa. Looked, not even touched. Gender roles are very different. Now, men hug each other a lot. Women do the same, and in families or friendships, of course, people do. When we speak standing up here in the hall, we're about arm's length, right? We don't measure. This is where it shows you again, it's not something you're aware of. When my father comes to visit, he talks to me 6 inches from my face. I cannot focus my eyes because I'm so anglicized. I go, si papi. I'm very uncomfortable. My whole body language shows that I'm uncomfortable. But if I were to pull back, that would be a hell of an insult to him. Because in the culture there, it's done very, very closely. He'll probably have his arm around me anyway. So you have to think in those terms. When we deal with East Asians a lot, I had a young, I had an advisee at Stanford who was Chinese American, first generation from Nebraska. Really thoughtful young man. And as we got to know each other a lot better and exchange intimacies, he said, Santiago, I want to let you know that I always resented my parents. And that was really sad to hear that, because that's not a nice thing to hear. And I said to Robert, was his name, I said, Robert, why do you say that? Because we live in this neighborhood, there were no Chinese people where I lived in Nebraska. And I always looked at English-speaking people around us, and they were always hugging and kissing their children. And my parents never did that. Public displays of affections, even in families, are relatively rare in Chinese families. It's considered negative. Does that mean that Chinese families love their children any less? By the way, in that, we're leading to notions of modesty and sexuality. Many cultures are, quote, more modest than others about these types of conversations. I found, at least in our environment, that American frankness about certain levels of sexuality, talking about sex, are tremendously embarrassing to other cultures, and more so than we realize. And yet we as Americans, by many Europeans, are seen as prudes. But we also have strange habits in asking about everybody's personal lives.
The world had a great time with the CNN report.
I made a point of looking at the European press because I have a newsstand near my house that has all the European and Asian and African papers, or magazines, not all, a good number. And I also listen to the BBC just for kicks. And I always also listen to the news reports from Mexico City because you get a different slant altogether. If you have Spanish channels, you can get that, by the way. Terrible news. But terrible in the sense that I don't like the guy who does the news. But it gives you a different perspective. And I like the British, maybe because I'm partial to that tradition in some ways, that said, and now let's turn to a rather unseemly spectacle in the United States. Without relating to the merits of the allegations, what they're talking about. The mere fact that it was done in the way it was. And it left me very uncomfortable, by the way. I'm a strong believer in providing safe environments for people. But I couldn't imagine that happening in many other cultures in the way that it did. We as a people often showing friendliness, which is a form of respect if you haven't thought about it. We also ask people, not only, gee, what do you do? Very common. But we also, gee, are you married? How many kids do you have? Oh, what does your wife do? What do your kids do? Huh? In many cultures, that's extremely rude. Extremely rude. Yeah, but the way we show friendliness is to do that. So be careful, and this is more if you're going overseas. I have global responsibilities in my company also. If you go overseas, be careful. This is again the filter, that this spontaneous friendliness may not be seen as friendliness at all, that is invasiveness. So you have to be careful. There's do's and don'ts, by the way, if you're traveling to other countries, broad do's and don'ts that you can deal with. And be careful again, those are broad bands, not true for everyone. In Singapore, for example, a sign of respect, most cultures like to be nice to other people by feeding them. That's why we invite people to home for dinner, I suspect. It's a sign of friendliness and respect. In Singapore, which is mostly ethnically Chinese, it's been our experience that people who want to honor you give you a big banquet. The more courses and the rarer the courses, the more of an esteemed guest you are. And chances are, if you're not of that culture, you don't know how rare or the dishes are, unless you studied that or paid attention. You can certainly count the courses, that'll give you a hint. But at the end of a dinner, generally, almost all the time I've been in Singapore, held in informal Chinese customs, they will give you a bowl of rice. You may not be aware when you go to a Chinese restaurant and you order rice with your food, rice is generally seen as a filler. Rice is what poor people eat, because it's cheap and fills you. In a formal banquet, no rice is served, by the way, until the very end. And you'll get a bowl, and at best you eat 3 or 4 of the grains, or none at all. That tells your host or hostess that you've had more than enough, that they did a good job of feeding you. We've been taught to empty our plates as a sign of right? So if you finish the rice bowl, you're telling them there wasn't enough to go around. And that's a horrible insult in any culture. Right? Most cultures want to give you more than you can eat, right? 2, 3, 4 helpings, whatever. Anyways, I'm just giving you some quickies. Space, again, just because you're here. We sometimes, as a sign of reassurance, whether personally or professionally, sometimes put our hand on somebody's shoulder. It's not common in American culture. We didn't realize in Japan with our Japanese employees, in Japan it means you're fired. And one guy that happened to that I was there ran screaming out of the room because he thought he lost his job. And we were totally innocent. We didn't know what was going on. Because he was speaking Japanese, and I only speak 2 or 3 words of Japanese, and my colleague who was with me likewise. Then we understood what happened. By the way, as an aside, in an office, most of us, if we have a choice, would like an office with a window. In Japan, if they put your desk at the window, it literally means look for other vistas. It's not a plus. It means it's time to go. It's not as quick as this one, but it means you got a little bit of time, but you are look at the big world. That's the symbolism of it. Little things. Those things are not things you need to remember, but those are things that are very fun sometimes, and sometimes scary in international communications. Communication, direct or indirect. Some cultures are very verbal. Some use a lot of implicit understanding. Let me give Japan as an example again. One, because it's often uppermost in our mind. But Japan is said to be, like many other cultures, a very contextual culture. Any of you follow Japanese movies like Kurosawa? And sometimes, even though the beauty of the images may be considerable, you're wondering, my God, nothing's happening? I'm overstating it, but I mean, let's be real. When you watch Ran for 4 hours and it's going on in beautiful imagery, but it's by Western standards a very slow developing story, and by the way, it is the story of either Hamlet or Macbeth, I forget. It's one of the Shakespearean stories he adapted to the Japanese. When I say contextual, Japanese culture is so homogeneous in many ways, culturally, that any symbolism that is used is generally understood by most people. And that fills in the gaps. We are a descriptive culture, which is one reason Americans are so good at telling stories, so good at really, if you think about cinema and books and stuff of that sort, because I think there's a correlation. Because we are so mixed that we have to explain. And we're not the only culture like that, by the way. There are many cultures in which this descriptive approach occurs because we don't have common symbols. And of course we do have a set of common symbols, but not nearly as much as a totally homogeneous, not totally, but a heavily homogeneous culture like the Japanese. So that if a flag goes up against a red sky, and I'm making this up, that has a meaning. Whereas in America it might to some people, but not to lots of other people. So therefore you use the narrative, you use the explanation. Relationships. When I mentioned benefit structures, I gave the one of significant others, but what do you do also in cultures that use define family in different ways, for example, in corporate settings? In my experience, and I'm not an expert in the African American community, not unlike the Puerto Rican community, many of us were raised by aunts, by grandmothers. Extended family, sometimes not our direct parents, either my father split, but mother had to work or go somewhere else to get work. Economic reasons, by the way. Is that immediate family an aunt? I think so. And that's why I said the high road is terribly important. And you need to be very sensitive, even if it doesn't follow IRS definitions of family or ERISA, that if you're going to be culturally sensitive, and remember, you're going to empower employees and make sure they feel part of it, that you're sensitive to different traditions. And generally go on people's words, by the way. When I lived in the South, sometimes less well-meaning people, otherwise described as racist, would sometimes make comments about blacks saying, gee, black people are always going to funerals. When you look like this, by the way, regardless of my ancestry that I told you about, you hear a lot of things in a personal setting, because I'm one of the boys. But it's embarrassing to people when they find out I'm not. And we're less worried about their embarrassment to them, sometimes saddened to hear what I do here. But it does give you an entree, by the way. It does give you a sense. Because people need to be relaxed. And one of the things programmatically we all need to do is how do we provide a safe haven for this kind of conversation. That's number one programmatic issue for any corporation, any organization. I said earlier, and I think I didn't say it here, but if I did, stop me. I'd rather have people say foolish things than not say anything at all. I can deal with foolish things. I know where I need to go. With what you think, that's your private life, and that's your right. And I have no way of knowing what you think. So we spend a lot of time on what we call, for lack of a better term, legitimizing the conversation, dreadfully long term. But how do we do that? We try to set the tone in the company. We assume that most people are well-meaning. Where we find people who are not, we push back very heavily. But generally people say silly things like, gee, you're different from other Puerto Ricans. They mean well. What they're saying are rather foolish things, and what they say also betrays what they think about your group. And they're not even aware of what they think. Because generally when you explain what this means, people understand that they were being very foolish. I was listening to the description earlier in there with the young Chicano man, I think a white man, and a stupid Mexican. That's emotion too. It's how you come back in terms of technique. I think that's tremendously important. And by the way, you have to respect impatience. Many people are very frustrated and impatient. It's taking so long to get anywhere. And you also have to be respectful of anger and pain and hurt. And that's very hard to do, by the way. And also the personalization part. Back in the 60s, less so now, sometimes, very rarely, but occasionally an African American or a black person would come to me and say, Daryl, mad at me, you're responsible for 300 years of slavery. And I said, gee, I'm getting older, but that's a bit much. I wasn't being disrespectful. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. What I answered is, I own those things I can't control. And I do own those. And that I am responsible for. If you were to ask me beyond that, that as a citizen, and even more important as a human being, I have a certain obligation to make sure that there's fair play for everybody. And a rectification of sin and injustice and error, I can buy into that too. But I can't be held responsible for something where I wasn't there. See what I'm saying? Although I understand the anger, I understand the pain, but it doesn't mean you have to buy it. And certainly it doesn't solve it. Recognition and rewards. I don't know a culture that doesn't reward people when it's appropriate. In the United States, often, in the office anyway, in my experience, sometimes when people have a birthday, they give you a little present or something, or the office gets together and gives a little present too, right? Or somewhere else. What do people often say after they've just given you the present? Open it, right? In many cultures, that's extremely rude. In Japan, it's another case point, but also the culture I was raised in, you never open a present in front of the person who gave it to you. Because your face might betray what you really think. And it's a way of saving face, by the way. It's a way of saving face. Again, it's not a judgment of good or bad, it's a question of being different, all right? So you need to be aware of that. Let me give you an example. We have a plant in Singapore. It has 3 shifts. It works 24 hours a day. It's extremely productive. 80% of the people there are ethnic Chinese. The rest are mostly Malay and Indians, people from India. The plant manager, Chinese, he did a great job of rolling out a new product line last year because we really needed to get it out quickly, much faster than we anticipated. This stuff was selling a lot better than we thought. As a reward, we do bonus structures. We do a lot of special incentive awards. We have those written into your performance plans, independent of your performance evaluation. But I can bonus my staff anytime I want, by the way. I mean, I have a pool of money, but I can do that. I can also do things like saying, okay, take a weekend in Carmel or go to the Sonoma Mission Inn. That's the way you motivate people who work very hard, in addition to their salary and their other benefits. And we can also give hefty bonuses for something that was really important. So in this case, we decided to give this man $50,000, which is not a trifling sum. And we did it wrongly, though. We did it Cupertino, California style. We had a communications event, as we call it. We have a lot of those things, by the way, very rah-rah type things. I thought I was getting into a Japanese company, by the way, because that was my stereotype in singing the company song. We don't have a company song, but it's close. At any rate, what we did is we called the whole plant into a big auditorium in Singapore, because we generally rented an auditorium or something, and we'll have food and entertainment. In Cupertino, for example, the first one I went, we had Harry Anderson from Night Court, is the MC. I mean, they do big stuff. For our events, we had Ella Fitzgerald do the singing, first of all, and then we did this and this and that. I mean, it's amazing. At least to me, it was amazing. I thought I came from a poor environment at Stanford. Stanford isn't poor, by the way. But relative to this one, it is. And we haven't cut down because of the overhead issues. But at any rate, in Singapore, we brought, but you got to cut down wisely. When we rolled out the new Macs in Japan, you know who we used for our ad campaign? Janet Jackson. Name recognition of Macintosh went from 2% of the population to 37% in a week and a half. Because Janet Jackson is a folk icon in Japan. She did all right by us, by the way, in the process, as you would guess. But they use a popular entertainer. And the fact, by the way, interesting in Japanese culture that she's black wasn't even terribly relevant. Japanese see her as an American folk icon. Race is secondary. They're not even aware of it. She's American, number one. And in that sense, progressive music, etc., etc. But at any rate, in this Singapore event, we got this auditorium, we brought all the plants in, 1,200 people, guy on stage, and we said, thank you, and here's $50,000. The guy died. Because in that culture, when you do public recognition like that, you have to make references to group efforts. It was a group man. He wasn't the only one that did the plant work. All his employees did. He died, not literally but figuratively. And he had to atone, by the way. He had to atone. He could not keep that money. He had the biggest dinner party that Singapore had ever had and invited the entire plant and spent the entire money on it. He didn't keep a penny of the 50,000. By the way, he would have taken the 50,000 if it had been given to him quietly and privately. So you have to be sensitive to these approaches. And if you run in and just assume this is going to work, it doesn't necessarily work. We're running out of time, but let me tell you about my job. One reason I work a lot of hours in time is, and I think it's sublimation of different sort, I don't know, I just really like my work. And I'm lucky. I really feel blessed. I enjoy going to work. And I get to pretty much write my own ticket, which is also part of the environment that I bought into. When I got hired, I said, I'd like to do the job in this way and define it this way. I said, great, go with it. It's a very fluid. Our strengths, by the way, are also our weaknesses. Our strengths are lack of rules, lack of structure, lack of hierarchy. That's a strength. It's a very empowering environment. Weakness, you're always reinventing the wheel when there are no rules. Because people will give you different answers to the same question everywhere you go. And when you don't have infrastructure. So you have to balance it. In any places where you work, your strengths are your weaknesses. You might want to think in those terms. Because generally there's sort of polarity in life. What I look at is product development, design. I look at marketing. And I look at customer satisfaction. And I have a neat job, even though it's lodged in HR. In other words, how do you use human resources to do these things? Because that's where HR brings value added. Not in being a transactional occupation where you fill out forms. Because that's what HR is in most places. And I'm not saying that condescendingly. People make decisions, you implement them, and here's the paperwork. That to me is not a very glorious profession when you think of it in those terms. And by the way, as an aside, I find that many HR people often have very low self-esteem. I don't know about you, but I sometimes go to parties and people ask those rude questions, what do you do? So you feel compelled to, what do you do? This is HR. It gives me a hint that they're not very happy about being there. That's an observation, not a fact. Because I sometimes felt apologetic too. We limit ourselves across the board. Product design. I've got a few minutes. Point one. I try to point out to R&D engineers, who are nice people like anyone else, but they are different. There's a culture of occupation. It's no accident that the only safe jokes left are lawyers' jokes, okay? We assume that lawyers have certain cultural characteristics as a group, not as individuals. I've known some nice lawyers in my life, but not many. All right? Okay. Our accountants are, on average, the same type of people who go into marketing or sales. Probably not. Although there may be people, of course, who fit both. Anyways, I point out to R&D engineers, says, look at, first of all, at the PC, a personal computer keyboard. Has it occurred to you that a PC keyboard is right-handed? If you're left-handed, you probably noticed it. Because I will argue that the cultural factor of being left-handed was missing in that design. What makes it right-handed, by the way? PT's calculator on the right. With our technology with the mouse, the cursor, you couldn't even get one on the left until about 5 years ago. Which gives you quite a clear hint that it was right-handed people who designed it. Now, some of you who thought about this a little more will say, wait a second, Santiago, but some of the most commonly used letters in English are on the left side. A, S, E. And they are. But some of you will also know that we got this from the old typewriter technology, right? And if you remember the really old typewriters, what happened if you typed too fast? Then, you see, right-handed people deliberately put some of the most often repeated letters on the left side to slow right-handed people down. Still a right-handed cultural idea. By the way, where's the return on the typewriter? Right. If you're left-handed, you go like this, unless you're ambidextrous, right? Point two, much of our most successful equipment, as well as those of our competitors, have stationary screens. In other words, they don't rotate, they don't move. Give me a quick hint that they were designed by very young people. And by the way, the median age of the designers was 26. Why did it give me a hint? Because when you don't have a tiltable screen, and if you wear bifocal lenses, which is a factor of aging, you have a hard time working on that type of screen. You either work like this, or you put something, a brick or something underneath to tilt it back. So the culture of being older, or specifically needing bifocal lenses, was not even thought of. And remember, we're not about being nice. I want to restress, it's important to be nice. 15% of humanity is left-handed. Presumably they would prefer to buy a left-handed unit. Many people need bifocal lenses. Presumably they would like to buy an adjustable screen. And by the way, since many of them are over 40, most of them, they also tend to be decision makers who buy our equipment. That's a marketing issue, all right? Third point, for years people told my company, really love the Macintosh, great stuff, can't afford it. Love to buy my daughter one at home. But who can spend $3,000 to $6,000 on a home unit? Part of the reason the prices have come down is the technology. I said electronics technology is in practice for years. It comes down in price. You've seen that with VCRs, with TVs, with everything. Same with PCs. But even beyond that, that didn't explain why they remained so expensive. The conclusion we reached, which is cultural, was that we were designing computers for our friends. Let me explain that. Computer designers anywhere in the world, computer engineers, are almost by definition upper middle class people by virtue of their occupation. I don't care where they are in the world. And upper class people who are nice people like anybody else tend to have friends just like themselves, just like anybody else. And they presume that that's the way the market is. Wrong. Because I would argue that different socioeconomic cultural factors, thinking about this, we would have come to what we euphemistically call a low-end product much sooner. Americans don't like bad words, by the way. Low-end means cheap. By the way, euphemisms can tell you a lot about what a culture values. Why do we have senior citizens in America? What is wrong with being old? Clearly the culture doesn't think it's good. In many cultures, old is very good. And they don't have euphemisms like seniors. There's lots of those. Have you noticed that in America people don't die? We don't. We pass. If you look at British papers press, people die in England. Presumably they speak the same language. But they don't have the hang up. We have a hard time dealing with that. Most cultures do, by the way.
We don't never agree to use the word death insurance. We have life insurance when you die.
That's fine. I never thought of that one. That's fine. Yeah, because that's, the insurance company knows you're going to die somewhere along the line. It's just a matter of when. All right. I have international responsibilities, and we do design for global reasons. And sometimes people think that a generic approach works everywhere in the world. It doesn't. We have a new software coming out that isn't public, but I'll tell you about one item of it. We use, as you know, the graphic interface. We use icons, drawings. We have a new one called a move. It's drawing of a half cow and a half dog. And Apple's very cute. And we now have sound bites, as you know, in computers. So you can program your own PC. Mine does all sorts of things, all right? And you can do it with your own recorder. You can record from a video, from a TV, anything, or music you like, and put it in to any appropriate command. So on the move, when you click onto the move graphic, it goes move. Presumably what a half cow, half dog would sound like, right? And I thought it was really cute when I saw that. But this is funny. Then I started thinking, how well will this sell in India? Probably not very well. In India, it's probably seen as very disrespectful. In addition, you may not know, other than cows in Hinduism, you may not know that dogs in much of the Islamic world are filthy creatures. They're not cute, cuddly little things that we keep around the house. One of the nicest insults you can do with a Muslim guest is to bring the family dog in so that you can pet him, which we think is strange, right? I can remember your own values focus inward and then outward, because you can't know about all of these customs. Islam is the largest religion in the world today, much bigger than Christianity. People don't realize that, and growing much faster than Christianity. Over 1 billion people in the world are Muslim. That's a huge market. Huge market. 700 million people are Hindu. That's a huge market potentially too. It isn't now in real terms. So you need to think in those terms. Marketing. When I first came to Apple, I asked a young white man who was now a friend of mine. I said, he was in worldwide marketing, what do we do in the African American community in the United States? He's very nice, very progressive, the euphemism for liberal. And liberal is not a nice word anymore. Nobody wants to be called liberal. I'm kidding. But the N word is progressive, right? And socially responsible. I'm not knocking it. Symbolism is important. But the point is, he said, I really care about black civil rights in the country, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and I certainly didn't vote for Bush, blah, 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 blah. But black people are poor. But I appreciated his frankness, even though he was wrong. Black people on average, of course, are poorer than whites. That's part of the curse of our history, if it is. But over half of the black experience in the United States is solidly middle class by any standard. Importantly, over $300 billion in disposable income in that community. That's bigger GNP than most countries of the world. And if you have that kind of filter, you're not being very smart. Remember, the standard is always to be effective. I asked the same question about India. He said India is poor. India is very poor. Horribly low per capita income. But India is a country of 1 billion people. 1 billion. And only 7% of India is middle class by Western definition, 7%. But if you translate it into numbers, that's 70 million middle class people. Twice the middle class market of the United Kingdom, where we have a huge market. See what I'm talking about in terms of filters? And these are pretty evident. We also did a worldwide advertising campaign about 5 years ago before I got to Apple. We have very good graphics, as you would guess, and we're very creative people. And they did a beautifully aesthetic poster, a photographic poster, of a very handsome young white man, blonde, naked, waist up, worked out, holding the globe on his back. What's the legend? Atlas, strength, endurance, power. Power to do your best. Nice, because when we started in China, the people looked at us and said, interesting concept. This guy's got the globe on his back. What does it mean? Because in China, the world's on the back of a turtle. If we try that one in the U.S., we get the same response. Interesting concept, but what does it mean? You have to be careful that you assume that legends and myths are universal. They are not. As the world's gotten smaller and people have more access to different cultures, yes, we learn about others. So that probably will be eroding more, but be careful even with what we consider commonly held myths. Because we have a European focus in our experience in education, we are aware of most Greek legends, the major legends. The one that's most important to me from a professional and human resource perspective is the Pygmalion legend. Did I mention this one before? No. Do you remember Pygmalion in ancient Greece, the sculptor? He did a beautiful statue of a woman in marble, so beautiful that he fell in love with her, wished that she were alive. The gods heard him and did what? Made her come to life. The whole notion of self-fulfilling prophecies. We've seen it in education. If you don't think someone is going to do well, often they don't. If you think someone is going to do well, chances are they will. We see that with our children. Tremendous. I spend a lot of free time that I have, and it's not much, with very young children today, in terms of self-image and recognition. Because kids or adults who don't think much of themselves don't do well. But when that is negatively reinforced by teachers and employers who don't think people are going to succeed, you get the double whammy. Some of the courses we've developed that other companies are doing too are what we call, I think I mentioned this, personal professional empowerment for people of color. That speaks to the Pygmalion conference, all right? And teaching, obviously, managers, not only putting the burden on the so-called victim, I don't like the term victim, but also with the manager to understand that that syndrome is occurring. And in my experience with most white managers, by the way, as well as other managers, they understand that that syndrome is afoot once you explain it. Because it is in the back of people's minds. So that if you're good, in other words, a superstar, and you're a person of color or a woman in a non-traditional situation, you're a pleasant surprise. Gee, we've got somebody good. What a surprise. I mean, don't you have good criteria for hiring people? That's what you're supposed to be hiring. See what I'm getting at? I'm not being cynical, but there's an element of that. Customer satisfaction. How in the world do you please a customer if you don't know what he or she values? Unless you have a monopoly, and I had a slight dig at our public service colleagues earlier, because that is a monopoly. But that's generally not true in private enterprise. I don't know about yourself. I'm even willing to pay more sometimes if I feel that the competitor has treated me poorly. Obviously, it depends on how much and on quality. But to a certain point, I will certainly shop around. And I think all of you do too. And much of that can be insensitivity based on lack of cultural understanding for a whole variety of groups of people, by the way. The final thing, and I've got to run in 5 minutes because it's going to be a cat out front, is I really think there's a taboo in America in talking about difference, particularly race. Unself-conscious discussion about race and racial mixed settings don't occur in America today, even when race is the issue. And yet we know it's the issue. And as you know, problems don't go away just because you don't want to talk about it. That's why I said, have people say foolish things, but in a proper environment, rather than not say anything at all. I'd like people to tell me about their fears, about their stereotypes, and then you can work it through. Because most people, I really, as I said, I have to belabor this point, I think mean well. They're willing to empower themselves to learn how to do this. Many people ask me, well-meaning people ask me, Santiago, I'd like to be better at this. How do I do it? They ask for tools, and you can't recreate a whole life's experience, all right? But from this come a lot of things. With this lack of discussion, there's the non-presumption of competence. People of color, women in non-traditional jobs, persons with disabilities, anybody on the out, I rarely have ever presumed to be competent. I saw that at prestigious Stanford University, which is now, by the way, 45% of color, in case you're not aware of the demographic changes in California. Berkeley now is only, University of California, Berkeley, probably one of the finest of state universities in the country, is only 30% white. That speaks to the changes that are occurring in my state anyway. So we live with it in that sense, and it's very real. But this syndrome affects people. Everyone I know of knows this exists. And certainly the client population. And people who know this exists feel that they're constantly being tested on non-merit factors. Folk wisdom, right or wrong, in minority communities, the term I don't like, as I said earlier, and women and other groups is, you've got to be twice as good as a white man to be successful. Now some of them may be personal baggage, sometimes it is. But some of it may be very real. And the irony is, on the other hand, many white people think we were all hired because of our race or sex. That's the double whammy, all right? People who feel tested constantly, by the way, have often an inability to relax. Well-meaning white people sometimes ask me, Santiago, why are these people so touchy? Maybe it's because they can't relax. Because you can't be yourself. You can't relax, you can't be yourself. When I was much less wise, much younger, much more racist, to use the term, because we all are ists. I had a rule for 2-3 years, and I was not raised this way, that I would only socialize with Latinos. So for 2-3 years, I kept that going. And we had this unwritten rule that if we had a party, this was in D.C., if we had a party, you could begrudgingly bring what we used to call an Anglo. Not a good term either, because Irish people are not represented correctly. But you could never have more than 10% Anglo at a party. I don't know who made up this rule. There it was. Okay? And you know the reason we gave? Not the real reason. We were lying to ourselves. The reason we gave is that we all know that Anglos don't know how to have a good time. They are dull people. They put a chill on things. Not true, it's a stereotype. You know what the real reason was? We had very low self-esteem. If our Anglo friends and colleagues showed up, they'd see us being ourselves. And ourselves meant ethnic. And we knew that being ethnic was not professional. And those very same people would know us in our professional and other lives and would make a transfer between that behavior and our professional behavior. We were limiting ourselves in that process and giving the wrong reasons, all right? People who undergo this testing and non-presumption issue have an even bigger problem professionally, and that is an inability to ask for help. Because if you know that people think this, how can you possibly ask your colleague or your manager or supervisor for help? Because even the mere act of asking might send the inadvertent message that you don't belong. That's why managers need to know about this syndrome and employees need to know about this syndrome. Because it's a two-way street. You can limit yourself artificially, but we also need to give managers the tools to say, listen, you got to be proactive as a manager, because that's what a good manager is anyway. People who have an inability to ask for help, this is a whole sequence, often self-segregate, some I don't like. We have a lot of beer bashes at Apple. We're trying to change those in part, keep them, but they sound very male-oriented, sort of a fraternity party gone wild. Because it really is. If you don't wonder what people at Stanford were 5 years later, they're at Apple, all right? I'm exaggerating, there are other schools there too, but not much. But anyway. And that is beer bash. I don't like crowds, so I try to stay away, but I go. Because that's where you meet a lot of people and form that you can hook up with later. Networking, something I don't like either. I have a lot of dislikes, all right? But anyway, I don't see many people of color and often not many women there. So I've asked some of my friends or colleagues who are of those groups, and I say, hey man, I didn't see you. He said, well, I got to put up with those people all day long. The last thing I want to do is spend any more time with them. This is my time. I said, you have a right to make that judgment and decision, by all means, but you have to know what it costs. And you then make an informed decision on what it costs you and whether it's a risk you want to take. Because it does cost. Now, we have an obligation to do what we call more multicultural events, and we do. We now have many African American celebrations as part of Beer Bashes, or Latino, or Asian, or whatnot, women's events. The senior women, by the way, decided to get together every month and deliberately decided to hold afternoon teas. And these are vice presidents. These are, heavy level people. Just to send a message to the boys if you want. The reason I don't like self-segregate, it assumes that the burden is all one-sided. I have a friend who works at IBM in San Jose, white man engineer. Once in a while we have lunch together down there in these vast IBM cafeterias. You have to be careful these days. But anyway, no, you didn't get the references. But anyway, and as we go in, and a friend by definition is someone who can take liberties with you. A friend is someone you trust. A friend can be outrageous with you because you trust them. And he does that with me, because he knows how to get me. And when we walk into these cafeterias, I'll punch you on the shoulder and say, Rodriguez, you're into the civil rights stuff. Look at all the work that IBM's done. And IBM's done a lot of good work at second generation level, the classic affirmative action level. They haven't moved into the diversity area very well yet. Says, look at the work that we've done, and look at all the black people eating together. Look at all the Mexicans eating together. Look at all the Orientals eating together. Absolutely right, by the way. Half of black remembers perspective. He hasn't seen all the white people eating together. Because you see, that's normal. That's why I don't like that term. It presumes that the movement is one way. In fairness, America is not at a level where the average white man walks up the table of 8 black guys and says, let me join you. And by the way, respectfully, people sometimes do need their space. And we as corporations, organizations need to provide that. We actively encourage employee organizations for that reason. We just had our first Applewide National Black Conference. Every black employee told us how this worked. We only have 2 criteria for organizations. You have to be in accord with our values as a corporation. Because I always get the questions, what about a chapter of the White Aryan Nation? Or KKK, people love to ask those questions. And, of course, hypothetically. And I would say, no. Since I'm never being a hypocrite. I said, no. I know from their charter that they're not respectful of individuals. I have no problem denying them, because they're not in accord with our corporate values. And the other thing which is also relates to them is every organization at Apple, no matter its focus, is open to anyone. The gay organization was really excited. They came to me and said they had their first self-avowed straight member. So I turned around and said, how do you know? Anyway. But anyway, the first thing, and this is the subject of another talk, is all what this does to self-esteem. I do have a cab waiting, so I got to run. And I literally have to run, so I can't talk to anyone. I apologize ahead of time. But the thing is, if I hear in Spanish anyone, I know it exists in the African American other community, Santiago, tú eres de buena raza. You're a good race. Or expressions like that. Or when I'm introduced to families in the good old days when I was very eligible, people with daughters saying, mira que güero es. Look at how fair he is. Or when a Spanish TV network, unnamed, in Los Angeles, is asked, how come its anchor people always look fair-skinned Europeans? Because we have a broad variety of people. Most of us are much darker than me. And the station manager answers, we want to show the rest of America that we have beautiful people too. We got a long way to go. Muchísimas gracias. Thanks.
Come from one another.